Hello and welcome back to Repod, the University of Salford's research podcast, which goes out live on video and then is published later on Apple and Spotify as an audio podcast. And we have the first in a series of videos, interviews over the next fortnight, where we talk to people that have been part of our Research Excellence Framework submission, the results of which were released just this week. So we'll be talking to a number of our staff that have been particularly involved with the impact case studies. These are stories that tell the impact of our research over a long period. And it's wonderful, partly because these are incredibly exciting case studies that talk to the importance of making sure that our research gets out there into the wider world and makes a difference within the community and often globally too. And I'm delighted to be joined by one of our case study leads today, who is hopefully on the stream in a moment. We've got Brendan joining us. Dr. Brendan Williams. Good morning. How are you, Brendan?
I'm good, thanks, Andy. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. This is really a fantastic week. We are also, as always, with the podcast experimenting, and we've had a bit of experimentation leading up into this interview, particularly with the audio, and we'll see if it works out well for us. But We're going out live on LinkedIn, the University of Salford's LinkedIn account for the first time, which is fantastic. So we're across 8 channels today: Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And it's great to start off with something so creative. So Brendan, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do at the university.
So, I'm the program leader for creative music technology. That's a pretty sizable undergrad music program. So we're kind of tied into the whole of the music department, but what we do in that program is focused, as you might imagine, around the use of technologies, whether it's to create music, to write music, whether it's working with audio for media, kind of film soundtrack or sound design, Foley, and then also, of course, recording music. So we've got a really nice suite of studios over in the new Adelphi building, and a lot of students kind of working with internal music students, and also bringing in external performers into the studio. So that's the day job. And then outside of that, I've for many years I've worked as a producer engineer, and worked on a lot of really interesting album recording projects, and I continue to do that. And that's what forms the core of the research, and obviously the core of this impact case study that we put together.
I mean, certainly I feel like I've been lucky to sort of grow up in the era where practice as research has really begun to flourish and be recognized and celebrated. And I think what's particularly interesting, speaking to people like yourselves, is to understand that connection. I think how you connect your own creative practice to the research. So tell us a little bit about the journey, because I imagine the music came before the research. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it still is something that runs in tandem. Let me think back. Okay, so this particular study is focused on the work that I've done with Go-Go Penguin. So Go-Go Penguin are ostensibly a jazz trio. They kind of look like a jazz trio on stage. Going back further, I did a lot of records with a Manchester-based label called Gondwana that's run by Matthew Halsall. So Gondwana initially started out as a fairly straight-laced jazz label. The premise was, let's make some records that sound sonically and also musically that kind of reference this golden age of jazz recording. So we were getting out of the kind of typical studio environments that were around Manchester, and we were working in big acoustically supportive spaces. So, I was having delusions of grandeur, thinking I was at 30th Street Columbia Studios in the 50s or something, or Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Englewood Cliffs. That was the sound we were trying to get. So I spent a long time developing that practice and just getting good at making jazz sound right. And then this band Go Go Penguin came along, and their influences, although they played acoustic piano bass drums, their influences were way broader than kind of blue and all of those amazing but admittedly pretty old classic jazz recordings. So they were listening to lots of electronic music, they were listening to lots of contemporary classical music, and I felt really strongly that recording those guys in a traditional jazz environment would be a bad call. So we started taking them into studios where I'd been working on, pop, rock, proggy, weird stuff. So we went out to Wales and did it in a studio up there called Giant Wafer initially, and just sort of changed the practice of recording jazz, really. Like we really sort of tried to turn things on the head, get as much separation in the capture as possible so that we could process and re-amplify, and just approached it in a very, very different way that didn't feel unnatural. It wasn't kind of calculated that it would become research worthy, but it became clear to me and to people that I was working with, and I've been really well supported by people like Professor Alan Williams and Joe Scott in our department, who really helped me to understand how it could be, that it was research and how it could be framed as research successfully. So I guess from that standpoint, moving on, the sort of seeds were in my mind, and I could tie the research to the practice once I understood how to frame it. So I did my PhD by publication and kind of wrote about a series of releases. So yeah, it's a long journey coming from solely a practitioner and being able to understand how to frame it as research. But I think I'm just about there.
I mean, it sounds like, it's almost like the way it should be, that the sort of recognition or realization that what you were doing as part of your practice was also a kind of research process. So it's not like you're adding into it kind of artificial things. It's just sort of trying to articulate it as research. Is that how it sort of worked?
That's exactly how it worked. So I've always felt really conscious that, see, this is the real difference, I guess. Well, no, that sounds highfalutin. I'm sure there is lots of research that hangs on the back of a commercial activity or an artistic activity, and that's the really fine balance that I can't force an artist that I'm working with to do something that suits my research aims. It has to be something that is mutually beneficial. So I guess one could argue that may be detrimental to the quality of the research, that there's this sort of external factor influencing the research, but I've never seen it like that. I think it's about making sure that that there's synchronicity between the two things. So, that sonically what we've wanted to achieve with these Go Go Penguin records, and I should absolutely mention that all of these records are co-produced with a chap called Joe Reiser. Joe was one of our undergrad students and then one of my MA students. So I kind of brought Joe into this project. So that's been really lovely to work with him, and the fact that he's got this kind of link to Salford as well. But yeah, we can never say we want to do this crazy spatial movement and sodgy tune. Like, yeah. it's gotta be mutually beneficial. And but actually, the more we do things, I think the more they've seen how that can function. So we've done all kinds of nutty things with binaural dummy heads, and like the last full-length record we did, we brought 3 binaural dummy heads into the studio and kind of had one for each member of the band, and they were all used in very, very different ways. So they've kind of got on, completely on board with that, and been really tolerant of these dummy heads. We just did an EP at Real World Studios in Bath, which is Peter Gabriel's kind of amazing complex, and again use these dummy heads. So we're kind of incorporating dummy heads now as like creative capture for binaural reproduction. And if people are not familiar with that, binaural is kind of 3D audio, or surround audio for headphones, essentially, surround capture, that's being kind of implemented in lots and lots of, VR, AR and XR technologies at the moment. But it's a really old technology that still functions brilliantly. But we're incorporating that with also kind of height capture for Dolby Atmos representation. So there's lots and lots of things we're doing in this kind of creative musical context that we're then able to present in this research way, because it is kind of at the edges of where the medium is in a commercial sense. So it's working out how the audience respond to these, new interventions, and what the market is, and not in a particularly financially minded way, but it's like, are the listeners who are obviously very happy with what they've got in a stereo format, are they going to go for this, kind of extended sonic space that we're operating in? Yeah.
I mean, it's so interesting. It's so much of what you've said that I think is absolutely fascinating. And I want to pick up on particularly on the idea of how you work with your kind of practitioner base, because I think that you sort of mentioned that it's not sort of always necessary for research, or typically, traditionally, I think hasn't been for research to sort of think about the impact on that community. And I think that's changing so dramatically. I think that increasingly research at its most basic level, it has growing expectations to find communities of users, beneficiaries that can have some relationship and conversation with researchers in the process of its creation. So in all honesty, I think that the way you've done it is actually how all research should take place. And it's a big step for many people to find that way into it. But obviously in your case, if you're developing something that then has no utility for the practitioners, then what's its purpose? So it's I think a great model. And I suppose what interests me partly is also how the artists themselves sort of find a way into making use of what you're doing. So how do you sort of broker that conversation? I imagine it sort of comes out of you being kind of authentically part of that community, and you have a dialogue between the practitioners and yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the word, that is this notion of community, and it's a notion of culture as well. Like, there's no kind of faking that. I think that whereas artists and bands are always really interested in the potentials of new technologies, this relationship of producer engineer, when you enter into that relationship, we're going to go off and do a residential recording trip, and we'll live together for 2 weeks and eat together, and you effectively like join the band for that period. So just because you've got this new whizzy sound technology doesn't get you in the door. It's about what that can do for them. And I guess there are some nice examples of that. There's a track on the last album that we did called Don't Go, which is the final track on the record. And as the track finishes, we sort of physically walked a dummy head on a pole away from the piano through the doors of the studio. And it's quite a sort of quite an obvious, use of this technology, but like to give the listener a sense that they're physically walking away from the piano and out of the studio, and then the door kind of shuts behind, and that's the end of the album. So it's a very sort of literal use of this technology where you kind of put the listener in the player's perspective or somebody else's perspective. So I think when we've got things like that, that's a really easy that gets a really easy buy-in, because it's conceptually linked. Yeah. So there's a kind of conceptual link between the reason that we're using this technology and the music that they're making. But then I guess the next bit of it it's not harder to grasp, but what we're trying to do with the kind of spatial technologies is support compositional gesture. So where we hear or we kind of feel a compositional gesture, and what I guess we mean by that is composition sort of has a shape. Parts of songs we can sort of see as a shape or as a sort of line in space, if you will. So we try and use the spatialization to reinforce this, you know. So if we can, obviously, like traditionally you can move from left to right and then we can push things back and forwards, but now we can kind of move things around the backs of our heads and, you know, do all kinds of interesting things. I mean, perhaps this might explain this a bit. I won't necessarily. So this is like a. Well, I will play it, Andy. That would probably make more sense for people rather than me rabbiting about it. That audio okay? Yeah.
Yeah, good.
So what we've got there is a surround reverb chamber. So we've got 3 speakers pumping audio out into this very large reverberant live room, which is 80 Hertz Studios up in the Sharp factory, Sharp project, sorry. So the head is, we can push different elements of the track out through these speakers to create a reverberation that hangs around the back of the listener's head. So we've got this kind of sense of envelopment within a space. So we kind of re-amplify all of the individual bits of the trio into the space, capture it on the head, and then integrate that into the stereo version of the record. So it's about sort of creating spaces that support the music. So you've got this very literal movement in space that can like conceptually support the process, and then this different thing where it's about the way that we spatialize things and how that can support compositional gesture.
I mean, it's incredible just to see how much is changing around the creation of this sort of work. And I guess the audience experience or the listener experience is absolutely crucial here. But I wonder, how does that change the ways in which the artists sort of create the music? Tell us a bit more about the process of creation and how that differs, bearing in mind this new sort of way of thinking about engineering.
I'm just trying to think, does it affect the way the music gets written? Like, I mean, with this particular band, they're very much in a process of kind of change. Like they've recently they've a new member of the band, and that's changed things a little bit, but also they've really embraced working kind of directly with technologies. So it was always a little bit of a unwritten rule that we would do things acoustically, you know, that this whole, for a period, this notion of like a new subgenre of like acoustic electronica emerged. And it was the notion that it was a band trying to play electronic music on acoustic instruments. So they were, you know, kind of mimicking some of the interventions that technology brings to music. You know, they'd play in such a way that it sounded like a CD was skipping or something like this. So there's lots and lots of I mean, Rob, the drummer, he told me a really interesting story once that he listened to Aphex Twin Richard D. James and didn't know that it was made with samplers, and just learned all the drum parts acoustically. And they'd never been played, you know, but he was just like, oh, I can probably work. So it's quite hard. You know, and this is, you know, for people who haven't heard that record, it's really, really skittery, you know, like heavily processed. So he was kind of learning how to play things that were, you know, very much created through electronics. But now the band are working really heavily with electronics. So there's all kinds of synths on the records. There's modular synthesis. There's kind of sampling technologies that they're playing live whilst playing real instruments, you know. So Chris has got kind of keyboards that are controlling all kinds of different synths, and then Nick's got a little Moog, you know, like a Moog what is it, a grandmother, like little semi-modular synthesizer. So there's all of that happening, and that obviously sort of feeds into the potentials for spatialization. But when it
Yeah.
comes to actually playing as a trio, they're doing it in the way that they always have. But what they've got very good at is allowing us to put them in quite non-traditional spaces when we record. So we're separating everybody out. I don't actually have any images of Real World, but Real World's quite an incredible space, actually. It's a huge live room, and the control room is part of the live room. So we've got the piano in that space. We've got the drums in what is a former, it's a former watermill with a huge high space. So they're all in physically different, sometimes different buildings. And I guess that's, they've got very good at learning to do that and functioning in that way. And the reason that we do that is because we need that spatial separation in order to put everybody in these interesting spaces and kind of support their compositional needs. So it's, I think that answers the question, or skirts around it.
We've got another interesting question from Tom, who's on LinkedIn today, and asked whether this auditory effect can be scaled up to entire audiences, like a theatre. Is there that transformation to that taking place too?
It is. That's beginning to happen. And actually, I'm trying to make a project happen next year, actually, with Chris from Go Go Penguin and another chap, Robin Richards, that I work with a lot. And the intention there is to try and do live concerts within the context of an Atmos rig. So yeah, it is possible. The difficulty is if you're going to kind of play with these spatial processes and you want to put an audience inside a rig, you need to be in an extremely dead space, acoustically dead space. So it's funny, actually. I'm sat on Deansgate in central Manchester. And we used to have a studio over in the old Granada Studios complex. And in there, you've got these huge sound stages, which are acoustically really, really interesting in that you've got like a football pitch size space. And when you're enclosed in a space of that size, your auditory expectation is that you walk in and it's reverberant, and it's a big reverberant space, but actually they're the deadest spaces you could ever go. So it's this really odd feeling when you walk in that everything sucks in around you, and it's like being in an anechoic chamber or a very dead studio environment. And they're the kinds of spaces where you could do live representation and move things around in space with perhaps an audience in the round. So an audience in the round around the performer with a huge array of surround speakers around them. That's the kind of thing that's happening. There's a really exciting project happening as well. Actually, I work a lot with an ensemble called Manchester Collective, and they are doing a project called Weather. I don't know whether they've talked about this yet or not, but they are doing it. But again, Joe, that I work with Go Go Penguin, he does all of Manchester Collective's live sound, and he's doing this project. I feel terrible now. I've forgotten the name of this chap. Chris. He's an incredibly well-respected field recordist called Chris, and he used to be in Cabaret Voltaire and has done all kinds of amazing stuff with the BBC. But he's captured all of this amazing kind of naturally occurring sound, and they're going to present the concert in surround with a huge surround rig, and they're going to tour that as well. So there's like lots and lots of considerations about taking a rig like that on the road and making it feasible. So yeah, it is happening, and more it's happening. There are spaces that are being configured to be able to do that kind of thing.
I mean, it sounds like a fantastically exciting area to be working in as a practitioner, as a musician, a producer, and as a researcher. And I wonder, sort of thinking back to your impact case study, what sort of, I guess, has been the most sort of enjoyable aspect of it? Is it seeing the impact on the audiences or the audience experience, or tell us a bit about what you've really kind of got out of it as a researcher, I suppose?
Oh yeah, I think that is the. I mean, the most exciting thing about it is the quality of the work that gets produced. Like, I feel really, really sort of grateful and humbled that I've always, I've maintained this relationship with the band, because, I have to, like, cede 95% of that success to them. You know, it's brilliant music and they're amazing performers. There's no point making. I always, I say this to the students all the time. There's nobody wants to listen to amazing recordings of terrible music. Like it doesn't really float. So it's been, just really, really lovely to be part of that process. But undoubtedly, the reception and the reach of the work has been just amazing to watch. I think I probably speak for everyone, like the band and Joe and me. It's bonkers how successful that band have become, and I guess that's what really spurred us to put the impact case study together, because the reach has been so wide. And without getting too deep into the lingo, like reach and impact they're difficult to separate. The further the reach, you increase the likelihood of impact because it just reaches more people. But yeah, I mean, I guess when that band got the Mercury nomination in 2014, that was a real surprise, and that just catapulted things. It was, I really couldn't believe that. Joe phoned me and told me, and I had to phone him back 5 minutes later. Did you just say we got a Mercury Prize nomination for that really strange record that we made like a year ago? It was a real surprise, and that then, that then they were picked up by Blue Note. That just was huge, and Blue Note, as a subsidiary of kind of Universal and Decca in the States and in Europe, it just, it meant that we had like a budget, which was really good. And that perhaps goes back, like, if we were, as researchers, if we were to try and say, I'm going to make a full length, or I'm going to make 4 or 5 full length studio albums that investigate all of these technologies, there is no way that I could do that. No one in my school would give me the time to do it. No one, I don't think the AHRC would give us the budget, to do it. Like, so the only way that this can function is to tie and piggyback on top of the artistic and the commercial practice. That's how it works. I guess, I'm sure there's kind of similar academically focused research that can happen within film, certainly computer games, but it is always this process of finding like-minded individuals who can actually get the thing out into the world and getting a kind of mutually beneficial relationship to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important message. And just to sort of think through what's next for you, because I mean, it's incredible to have this sort of story as to what you've done so far and the impact it's having on the community itself. But I think musically and technologically, it's extraordinary. I'm so proud to hear about this research at Salford. So what's next for you in terms of the development of this?
What's next? So I'm, like I said, I'm off back down to Box. It's called Box in Wiltshire, where this studio is, and we're going to go down there for a couple of weeks and put this new studio album together. So that's going to be really exciting to get that done. Then also in the summer, I'm doing quite a big scale record with Manchester Collective and this amazing composer called Edmund Finnis. Ed's working with Ruby Hughes and working on it's a song cycle, and that will all be captured in, with like Atmos configurations. So there'll be too many microphones and not enough time to put them up. But like a really, really large scale capture. And I'm hoping that, see, the trick at the moment is getting the labels to think about whether they want to do this kind of release, because it's still expensive. So Atmos as like Tidal's adopted it. There's a few different streaming services that offer Atmos as a kind of music listening experience, but the idea is that it just folds down and it's dead easy, and you just make the record and then it folds down to headphones and everyone's happy. And that's a nonsense. Like, it takes quite a lot more work to make it happen. So at the moment, it's kind of this, I have a sabbatical coming up, and it's specifically to support the amount of time needed for me to turn these releases into something that can work in Atmos. So again, it's a really good example of like this piggybacking. So it's a 15-piece string orchestra and soprano in Stoller Hall for 3 days. That's a really expensive thing to do, like to put everybody together in that way. And again, that I can then come in and I'm making a release with them, which is going to be commercially released, but I'll put up all of the extra stuff to do the research.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have that time to turn it into an output, you know, that functions in a particular way. So again, it's just that example of how the research piggybacks on the kind of commercial process, if you will. So that's going on. There's loads of stuff. I'm going to Innovation in Music conference in Stockholm in a couple of months. That'll be really exciting because that'll be the first kind of physical conference that I've done in a while. I've got some irons in fires with more traditional research. So that's kind of peer-reviewed conference proceedings, and then there's a monograph that I'm hoping to put together over the next few years. So like a pretty large-scale written project. So yeah, lots and lots of like practice-based things, and then some real research. So.
It's all real research. I mean, it's amazing to hear this, Brendan. We unfortunately are out of time. I thought we were going to hear some more music, but sadly we've run out. But it's it's wonderful to hear these stories, and I think certainly in terms of bringing together a real understanding of how research connects with its beneficiaries, it's just a fantastic example of how to do it, really, and just how crucial it is to sort of be authentic in that as well. You know, it's not something that you can just sort of jump from one thing to the next. There's a kind of deep lifelong commitment really to it, which really comes through in how you speak about it. So, and then the other thing that just struck me is that I just feel like there's lots of ways of hearing that I haven't experienced yet that your research and your outputs are just making possible. So I really look forward to seeing what comes next and hearing what comes next particular. So
well, yeah, the thing to have a listen to if people do want to kind of hear some of these techniques is certainly the last record that we did, which is just a self-titled Go-Go Penguin record with the white cover. That's got quite a lot going on. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, look, thanks so much for being here, Brendan. This is the first of our Impact series, so it's a great one to start on, and I look forward to seeing you again soon, I hope.
All right. Thanks so much, Andy. I really appreciate it.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.